This is the Final Word Cricket Podcast. It's season 17. It's episode 23. It's Jeff Lemon and Adam Collins together again after a good week or so where we weren't. A test match happened in that time. The show's brought to you by CBUS Super, as usual. cbussuper.com.au. It's the end of the Australian international summer, just about. There's a couple of cheeky ODIs happening in Sri Lanka, but I do not think the eyes of the world will be on them. So I suppose we've got to get those out of the way first, but they're very much an on the way out the door sort of. Well, while I've got you, do you mind maybe 100 overs of knocking it about? A little bit of Champions Trophy prep. I suppose you could count that as it'll start in February, so technically it's Southern International Summer, but it feels like once all of the test matches are done, the women's test is finished, the men's tour of Sri Lanka is finished, we've reached some sort of ending point, even though there's a fair bit of summer to go and then into March in Australia. But you're back home. You've been in Sri Lanka, Adam. Tell me about it. I don't actually know much of what went on aside from what I got in the dailies.
Yeah, it's an abrupt return home. I had this massive journey. I got like a 4:25 a.m. flight. And you know what that's like? You can't really go to bed when you're sort of 3 hours from the airport, which just means it turned into like the longest day getting back to London yesterday. But, you know, it was lovely to be able to get home and get Winnie from school and a day earlier than would have otherwise been the case, which was cool. Went to choir last night despite still being sick. So, you know, struggling to hit the high notes when doing the tenor parts of Lady Gaga, which is what we're singing at the moment. Mostly I just want to play cricket. You know, like, because we played those 2 games in Sri Lanka. You know, like, I'm just desperate to bowl and bat. We played an ODB game there. I've got the beanie back on today because it's so freezing in London. It's like 2 degrees outside. But I just want the season to go into turbocharge right now in England. You know, I guess I'm coveting something of a break because I've worked pretty hard the last, 20 years. No, specifically the last year's been a lot, and I'm in the market for a few weeks off, but we're not quite there yet. As you say, we're into the Champions Trophy. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Winnie's birthday later this week. Then I'm back to Australia next week for, I guess it's like our Brownlow, Jeff, for the Australian Sports Commission Awards, our night of nights. So I'll be in Sydney next week.
We are Gary Hocking.
So we'll go.
Always polling, never quite getting there.
Yeah, so we went along to that last year at the MCG, and this year it's at the SCG. So I'm looking forward to seeing you there, Jeff. And I haven't told you this yet, but we'll record a weekly show when we're together in each other's presence next week and make the most of that. So, but yeah, I guess the 2 weeks to sum it up.
I would be naive to think that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. To sum up my time in Sri Lanka, it was an intense tour. This was one of the toughest tours I've been on, actually. It might be the toughest because I was so sick, as I described last week when it began. The radio box the radio facility that you know from last time that we had briefly before we got moved off for health and safety reasons. We were in there.
Charlene's wedding. When's the passion fruit pavlova coming out on the roof at Galle?
I mean, I would have craved any cooling down. I had to, change from a sweaty T-shirt into shirt sleeves whenever I was doing my television spots, but it was kind of like 2 radios a session and 1 TV a session. So when you factor in having to run between the boxes, that meant about 15 minutes off per session, and that's knackering, especially when over an hour of that is up on the roof and you're sweating bullets up there. So it was taxing, like, physically for me. And just on the TV thing, by the way, I know that we didn't really talk about me doing that ahead of the series because you know what it's like, Jeff. You're doing something like not new. I've done lots of television commentary before, but I'd never done an Australian Test series, right? And that's different gravy. You're being exposed to a whole different audience for the first time on free-to-air television, hundreds of thousands of people watching. I think like nearly 1 million watched one of the nights. So you don't want to get out there and talk too much about it in case it, doesn't go well, right? But it did. It went well, and I'm proud of that. And did the work and loved doing television, and was really grateful for all of our, I guess, Final Word community members for getting in touch and them being really happy that someone they knew, being me, was doing the thing that I was doing on television and calling things like the Khawaja double, Smith's 10,000th run, the winning moment, Smith 100 in the second test, and, like high profile moments that the TV commentary becomes has it become the soundtrack of the moment more than radio does a lot of the time? So that was a privilege and a great thing to do. So I'm happy to be home, and I'm glad I got through it the way that I did.
Yeah, there was definitely a sort of community rallying. People were chatting about it within our online chat corner of the internet. We're following it closely, and there was a lot of wondering on day one. They're like, "Is he crook? He doesn't sound well."
Yeah. Oh my God.
When you were
that was
green stuff coming out of all your pores.
Well, I got in there on day one because of the tent being the tent. We had to de-rig and re-rig every day, and first test on radio is always stressful anyway when you're setting up the equipment when it's like that. We had to do a little bit of that in Pakistan, didn't we, where we were setting up on the morning of test matches. But this was different. This was so much more complex with where the cables needed to come from. And day one's always a nightmare regardless. And I got to the ground at 7 a.m. and I thought I should wear a jacket, doing telly and whatnot. And because I was so ill, I'd sweated through everything I was wearing by about 8 a.m. Like, I don't just mean like a bit of sweat. I mean, I was drenched. My jacket was drenched as well. Trousers, the works. I'm like, what the fuck am I going to do here? In the end, I came up with a solution where I went back to the hotel after my first commentary stint, had a complete change of costume, came back in a t-shirt, hung a shirt sleeves up in the commentary box, and that was fine for TV, that is. But of course, in my first stint on, that was the Smith 10,000 5 minutes before lunch. And I had massive head fog. Like, I was all over the place. And I listened back to the commentary yesterday, actually, for the first time. Like, I'm surprised at how well that went. I definitely didn't have my voice at its best, nor is it good right now. I'm sick again, of course. I'm glad that the words got out all in a straight line, because it easily could have gone the other way. So by the time we got to day 2 or day 3, I was back in business, and the second test was good as gold. Knowing it was on Channel 7 and all of that back home, it was pretty important I got the 10,000 bit right, even if it was kind of in sort of second gear rather than fifth gear.
Yeah, you were very low key. And I was like, if that were on SEN, during the home summer, you would have been lighting off 44-gallon drums of explosives and basically going out the window and all the rest of it. And then that was, it was very much like maybe being sick gets you closer to the platonic ideal of Richie Benaud commentary, where it's like, just don't say too much.
Yeah, and I love that on TV, by the way, because it is a different medium, and it is a discipline when you're trained in radio to let the pictures talk. But I really like that. I think it's a great discipline to. I often, with my lip mic again behind the curtain, I shove it down in the squidgy beneath you, and I find the practice of shoving it down, I have to really make a decision to pick the microphone up.
Right.
So most balls I won't comment on.
A block of foam, for those who don't know. So there's a block of foam in front of you, and the lip mic is a handheld one that you hold up to your face when you want to talk. So on radio, you're wearing a headset, which means you're always on air. Effectively, like there's a cough button that you can use to switch off the headset, but you have to specifically switch it off, whereas TV, you have to specifically choose to speak by picking up the mic.
That's it. So like, I find the practice of actually like tensing up my hand and shoving it into the sponge means that I have to make a conscious decision to then pick up the mic on balls that might require comment. But like, as we've learnt when doing it before, Jeff, often even when something happens with the ball, you don't really need to say anything. If Alex Carey sweeps for 4, it might require a reflection on the angle that he got on the ball. That's it. That's fine. And you can pick up the conversation that you're having that might be adjacent to what's going on in the middle. And that's a nice thing to be able to drift into. And I love doing telly. So thanks again to Channel 7 for giving me that opportunity. It was a lovely thing.
We have a bit of news on the campaign. We met Murali, not in person, although he's been around before on Australian tours, but our campaign was not to beat him, but to meet him. He had 800 test wickets. We had about 700 people on Patreon. We said, what if we could get to 800 during the Sri Lanka series? What if we could finally achieve our long-held goal of catching up with the highest test wicket taker, given that we'd had other targets along the way, like Shane Warne's 708 and so on, that we'd been after, and getting ahead of James Anderson, which we eventually did. This time, we got him. We're at about 820 at the moment. What an amazing response from the community. Thank you to everybody who's heard that call and said, yes, an arbitrary nonsense milestone based around cricket stats. I want to be part of that. That's a big part of what our show is arbitrary nonsense around cricket stats. So it happened. We're past the 800 mark, and we've just got to figure out what happens next.
Yeah, I mean, that was, I think, 3 weeks ago on the weekly before I went out to Sri Lanka. I just said out of nowhere that, maybe we should get Murali while we were there, and our audience and our community immediately responded to that, which was amazing. I think we've added like 120 people since we said that 3 or 4 weeks ago, which is up there with the biggest spike we've ever had. The start of the pandemic, people got behind us initially on there, which was a beautiful thing and demonstrated to us at the time that we should keep doing this as often as we do it. But this was a surge that was appreciated. Obviously, it makes us that much more sustainable when our community's bigger. And I like the fact
the thing is we've got a massive year to fund, and there's not always a commercial part backing that
Correct.
up. So we've got a Champions Trophy to manage, which will be bringing in other people to help us out with, so that we can make sure that we have people who are on the ground. That's the way we prefer to do things, if at all possible, is to have people at matches, and we can't be in Pakistan and the UAE because of how erratic the scheduling is, and not being able to rely on the scheduling. So that's a big one where there's going to be a whole lot of outlay to make sure we can actually cover it. We've got a big test series in England at the same time as we've got to go to the Caribbean to cover Australia, West Indies for 3 tests over there. And that's, to be frank, one of the most expensive tours you can do is a Caribbean tour, because the inter-island travel is so difficult and so small capacity. There'll be a Women's World Cup in September in India, and then there'll be a home Ashes summer after a big white ball series with Australia and India. It's a ridiculous year, and we've got so much coverage to do, and this just makes such a difference to be able to shift the margins a bit and have a bit more flexibility with what we've got available coming in and what we can fund to put together.
Yeah, it's nicely summed up. Like, just to go back to the mechanics of this, like, we got to 800 10 minutes before the end of the test match because the app hadn't populated. You know how it like does that lag thing on
Takes
Patreon?
a while, yeah.
It was like 10 minutes before the final ball. We got to the 800 mark. And of course, it's a bit, I don't want to bore people with the mechanics too much, but it does, with the way credit cards work, some people come on, some people come off at different points of the month.
Some people aren't counted for periods for a week here or until they renew and blah, blah. So it's all a bit fudgy.
But the number 800 was on there. As Barat and I were talking when we thought it was 796 or something like that. So I think we've decided it's a bit hard, Jeff, because of that fudginess to say who 800 is, but we've picked 800 anyway because we feel like we
pick someone from in that bracket.
Who was the one who signed up? The signer-upperer 10 minutes before the final wicket was taken was Steve W. So Steve W. is going to get the phone call from the man who Murali picked up as his 800th wicket, which Barat has committed to. Oja. So that'll be something we do. I reckon that's a precedent as well, Jeff. Right, we've come this far, right? Why don't we commit Glenn Maxwell to things that I haven't asked him about? Why don't we get Maxi? Maxi, if you're listening, which you will be, let's charge forward to 1,000. Like, remember that Beyond 2000 TV show we watched as kids? You got to be ambitious. Why don't we
go for like a 9 for something like a Jim Laker? You know,
yeah, we could do that. But why don't we just see? Well, let's make this more fully formed as we go.
Okay.
Let's start at 1,000 and we can negotiate from there. And we will pick someone who Maxi will do a 20-minute Zoom call with. Thanks, Maxi.
He's got a bit on, you know.
Yeah, he does. He'll do it.
He'll have some airport time, maybe. He can do it from a lounge somewhere.
So if you sign up now, you can be pulled out of the hat. When we hit 1,000, we'll get you 20 minutes with Maxi on the blower. How's that? Does that sound good? I think that's good.
Yeah, like someone, I'd say you don't have to be number 1,000, but you've got to be someone from between now and 1,000, something
from
like
today.
That.
From the 11th of February until whenever we hit 1,000, you win the...
Alternatively, between now and 1,009, we pull your name out and you get to chat to Pranav Dhanavade, who made the 1,000, because Bharat can hook that up.
He can. He knows
the lad.
We can do both.
He myth busted him, so I don't know if Pranav is keen to get on the blower with Bharat these days. But
anyway, it's a nice thing. It's a nice thing.
That would be the most final word area possible.
So thank you everyone who's joined up and becoming part of our community. If you're new and you haven't worked out how to do Discord yet, just like send me a WhatsApp or something. My number's everywhere. Or send me a DM or Jeff's less so. You can find me on the internet very, very easily. A lot of people have in the last week. We'll talk about that in a sec. We can give you that direct link and it's all pretty easy after that. So you should be able to work it out because you're all smart people and you've signed up already. And we loves you for it. Patreon.com/thefinalword. Just to pick up one more point, Jeff, before we move on. You ran through everything we're doing this year. It's a fucking massive year, right? Selling ads is hard. Top line, selling ads is difficult. Finding commercial partners is never easy. It is always bloody hard work. Come to us, info@finalwordcricket.com. Find me, pester me, whatever me. Champions Trophy, Daniel Rasul, Andrew Fernando, Daniel Norcross and Cameron Ponsonby, who will be making sure that we have coverage every day from there. The blockbuster test matches between England and India. Australia, West Indies, where we'll be represented at as well. Likewise, the Women's World Cup. All in the build-up to the most anticipated men's Ashes since 05? Probably since 23, actually. It was pretty...
Probably more. I don't think... Since 06-07, maybe, there was...
So either way, it's going to be this is going to be a huge year for us, our biggest year yet. If you think this is something that could align with you, we've got great stories to tell about our commercial partnerships. Come to us, drop us a line, and we will do you a good deal because, that's what we do. We over-deliver. We under-promise and we over-deliver. That is what we do with our Final Word commercial partners, and we love them for it. And one of them, Jeff, has re-signed this week.
Yeah, NordVPN jumped on again because it's legit, because we actually use their service and did before they were involved with us. I think people can tell when you are talking out your ass and when you're not. And in this case, that's that's the VPN service that we use. And if you travel around a lot, you need a virtual private network because you need to be able to decide where you would like to be in the world as far as the internet knows, because the internet's full of things that say, well, you can't do this because you're here, but you can't access that because you're over there. Oh, you can't watch this 30-second highlights clip on some social platform because you're in the wrong geo region and all the rest of it. And if you got a VPN, you just go, I think I'll be in Algeria today. And there you are. It's sports and entertainment's a big part of their focus, which is why they work with us. So you can get your streams or your other content from home, even if you're away. You can switch your location to access apps and websites that only work in certain countries. And you can get access to social media and services that might be blocked in certain regions, all things that you can do with a VPN.
It's very, very good, Jeff. Another Sri Lanka story. I was sharing a room with Bretto, as I do when I'm on tour. I love sharing a room with Dan. We have a great time rooming, as we have for 10 years now. My first tour was in 2015, and I was with Dan then, as I was this week. And he was like hearing me drift off to sleep each night trying to watch the newsreader on iView. And I had because that's obviously not in England yet. So I'm like, well, I'll VPN and get it off iView, iPlayer. And of course, because I was so knackered, absolutely cooked on this trip, I was getting through like 1 minute before falling asleep and having to reboot it every night in the same place. So that was all possible because I was on my NordVPN account, is my point. NordVPN.com/TFW. Get your discount, get your 30-day guarantee, and have access to a VPN that we know and love.
That's it. That's all of the faffing about at the start of the show. We've got to get into some wash-up from Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka and Australia, the second test match that happened there, everything that's happened after that. Before we do that, we should talk about the situation with Pete Lalor, which you found yourself in the middle of, obviously in the context of like a massive geopolitical conflict where so many people have been killed and had their lives ruined. What is happening in a journalistic sense with people's jobs in Australia is not of major importance. It doesn't rank anywhere near mattering in the overall scale of this human tragedy, but it is relevant and it is significant. And there was a lot of conflict back and forth about it, with SEN deciding to sack Pete in the middle of a series, which made it very, very obvious that was happening. It didn't happen after the second test, happened before it, and you were leading the SEN broadcast, and a lot of people were asking what your perspective on it was, and I suppose this is the time to talk about it.
Yeah, and it is, and I'll explain why it's now and it wasn't then as we go through. I'm obviously very close to Pete, great mate of mine, great supporter of his work. He's been a great supporter of our work, like he was a wedding guest for Rach and me. Like, we love Pete. This is not a normal situation to be leading up a broadcast with one of your close mates. I mean, God, how many times have we celebrated birthdays with Pete on tour? And he's a central figure in my life, not just professionally, like full stop. Pete's a central figure in my life. So it's because of that, and this is important to note from the top, it's because of that closeness that Pete asked me not to get involved publicly. He said, to give a bit of understanding of the timeline here, I was the first person he spoke to when this was going down, I'm pretty sure. I don't think there was anyone else. As in, when the phone calls were going back and forth to Melbourne, he spoke to me immediately. And obviously I was shaken by it. If you went back and listened to my commentary, I don't know which stint it was specifically, but the 30 minutes I did on radio after this was all shaking out, I was clearly affected by it. And you would know that if you knew me and you knew me well enough to understand the way that I communicate. Yeah, there was a decision taken for me not to sort of ventilate all of this at the time, because I had not just one job to do, but as I explained before, this was a really important couple of weeks in my life, getting this opportunity with Channel 7 as well. And it's not about me, but I just want people to understand that there's all of this pressure for me to comment and tweet and talk. And you and I spoke, Jeff, and we will talk about this, but we'll do it after in our own way on our own platform, because there's no nuance on social media. I was already obviously I was already copying it anyway, but there would have only added to the chaos had I commented at that acutely sensitive time, especially when there were statements out there. I was obviously very aware of what Pete was writing and that he was going to put out a statement and effectively break the story himself. And the SEM were going to issue a statement, and I didn't want to get involved in the back and forth there. That would have been easy for me to have become a quote in this story. And, Pete's more than capable of standing on his own 2 feet and commenting in his own story. He wanted to do it that way. So that's one thing. Now, I didn't really know that there was this response to Pete on Twitter before a couple of weeks ago. Indeed, before this happened, I knew that Pete was tweeting a lot about what was going on in Gaza, but I didn't know that like it had turned into a thing where Pete was tweeting and then people were getting very agitated by his tweeting, and there was that back and forth there that wasn't like on my radar. And so that's why I was partly taken aback by the whole thing. I didn't really know what was going on. And I suspect, and this is just purely my opinion, I've not spoken to anyone about the thing I'm about to say right now. I think had his tweets been restricted to amplifying the human tragedy in the Middle East, it probably wouldn't have played out the way that it did. I think the fact that there were some tweets about the hostages after the ceasefire, that provided a hook for those who were already very cross with Pete, and that had a cascading effect. So, you know, the inability for this to be resolved was, as in this to be resolved privately or whatever, I think was limited by what happened at that juncture. So yeah, that's kind of what happened from my perspective. I don't intend on getting into a lengthy conversation about peace in the Middle East because I'm frankly thoroughly unqualified to do so. I was uncomfortable with some of the response online. I just want to say for the record that, you know, references to like Jews controlling the media and so on, like I didn't appreciate that. I think you can be supportive of Pete Lalor as a human being and as someone who wanted to amplify his opinions on what's going on in the Middle East, and also feel as though some of the response to what Pete was saying was inappropriate, because those types of tropes about the Jewish people have historically been, well, we all know what that's cascaded into at points in human history. Yeah, this is very difficult to talk about, obviously, but that's what happened from my perspective, and it was a very challenging few days. Not about me. It's definitely not about me. I don't want to make it about me, but it was an all-round very tough situation, and it's a tough situation because of the love and care that I have for him as a human being.
Yeah, it's a intensely shitty situation all around, and it's a difficult one to talk about, I think, because whatever you say, you know, people obviously have incredibly strong feelings about it. They will interpret you as either an enemy or an ally of their position. You'll be twisted into an anti-Semite or an Israel apologist one way or another. There's a reason why it's not the kind of thing that, you know, we do talk about political events, current event situations on the show at times, and this is just something that's been too complicated to get into, and I don't know, maybe we've been too timid to do it because of that risk of being misinterpreted, of being held up as being something that you're not. My read on it is that, like, the amount of suffering in this conflict, it's not just the last couple of years. It's obviously escalated massively in the last couple of years, but you're going back a century, really. There's been so much horror in this story, and a lot of the things are true at the same time. You know, anti-Semitism is real and pervasive and has been around for that entire journey, and it's still there, and in some ways it's flourishing. That's the truth. It's also the truth that criticising Israel politically is not anti-Semitism, and it gets twisted into being presented that way, which is very cynical and which is an attempt to deflect criticism of Israel's position. And it's also true that, you know, the Israeli military have created just an unbelievable amount of havoc, killed tens of thousands of people, made a couple of million people homeless. That's the reality, right? That's not a biased interpretation. That is just what has happened. And so there is a phenomenon that we've seen in Australia. We've seen it with the ongoing court case with Antoinette Lattouf and the ABC, where public-facing people, if they're critical of Israel or seen to be overly supportive of Gaza, you know, there are a few people who will try to run campaigns to get them kicked out of jobs. There'll be people who'll be incensed enough about that they will try to make that happen. So I don't know exactly how it went down in this case. It's hard to interpret a situation where it was different from that. I don't agree with that, but I also think that media companies are allowed to decide who they want to hire and who they don't based on what that person says. I think that, you know, Pete's position broadly was trying to draw attention to human tragedy. And I think that, you know, criticism of that is, oh, why are you drawing attention to this part and not to other parts? Well, because this part of the tragedy is the most recent. It's ongoing. It's been ongoing for such a long period of time, and it's at such incredibly staggering scale that, of course, that's where people's attention is going to naturally be drawn. This is the story that's happening in front of us now. So, you know, I'm sure that what I've said now will make various people angry in various ways, depending what their perspective on it is. But there is no way to talk about this without doing that, it seems.
Yeah, and that's why I was resistant to talking about it on Twitter. And I respect those who did, by the way, and did offer opinions. That's fine. Like, you know, the way that Dan Cherney tweeted about it, for example, I thought was commendable, noting that from his perspective as a proud Jewish man, Pete's not anti-Semitic. And he compared and contrasted it to the fact that, you know, Sam Newman was literally interviewing a neo-Nazi on the same day that this Lawler story broke, right? And the response to Dan tweeting about that is like, this is where you see genuine anti-Semitism. Whereas with Pete, again, just to back over what I said before, some of the things that he reposted or retweeted or whatever you want to say did provide the hook, and it was specifically in relation to the hostages, wasn't it? That they're the screenshots that do the rounds most. I knew that if I got into it on this, I'd have to be talking about that and like, well, where does it stop? Do you go through and do a catalogue of every single thing that Pete's ever retweeted? It's not sustainable to do that. So I thought, better just to give a time frame, timeline, whatever, from my perspective, and explain why it was, I felt appropriate for me to deal with this privately. Obviously, I was talking to Pete throughout this process. Everyone who knows me would know that, and provide Pete support privately. Whereas had I gone the other way and decided to become part of it, it would have dominated every single inch of my life. Some of the stuff was like, I'm a member of the Labor Party, therefore I must have gone on Israel junkets. I mean, all this nonsense. The stuff about my children, I mean, fucking crazy shit, right? Like, people who really should know better. But that's unfortunately the nature of the online environment that we all live in. I mean, I wish we didn't.
So we should get to the Test Series wash-up, 2-0 for Australia. I mean, I found it interesting how this was presented as, well, obviously they smashed them because Sri Lanka are shit and, you know, they're a third-ranked team and blah, blah, blah. I mean, Australia haven't played well there the last few times. I kept talking about this in the preview. They got whitewashed in 2016 when they had a pretty decent team in a lot of respects. And they could only draw the series last time they went a couple of years ago. It was 1-1 and Sri Lanka beat them heavily in the second test of that series. So to go over there and make it 2-0 and make it really not a contest throughout, you know, Australia ran both the games. Smith back to what looks like Pete Smith form, being able to use the conditions, you know, 400s in 5 tests and all the rest of it. It's very retrospective engineering to go, well, actually Sri Lanka sucks, so those don't count as wins.
Yeah, this happens, right? When I think Sam Perry made this point on Grade Cricket the other day. When Australia get too good, people get bored and look for reasons why everyone's too shit. So, yeah, Sri Lanka had a shocker, but Australia planned meticulously for this. You could see that the criticism of the Dubai trip cut through by Travis Head and Nathan Lyon, posting about it when they were having beers in the dressing room, getting stuck into Eddie Cowan, who called it a golf trip in Dubai before. I mean, it was obviously a very important part of their planning. They also clearly played a lot of golf. Both things were true at the same time, right? And Bretto made a point on this too. It shows in a way that we don't know necessarily what goes on in the inner sanctum of this very public team. They're quite happy with that. They're quite happy to have their private views on things and not to, probably coming back to what we were saying a moment ago, not ventilating every opinion they've got, because they had the ability to let their playing do the talking. And what you said about Smith then, 400s in 5 test matches, the overall record. Glenn Mitchell posted an excellent tweet overnight, which compared Ponting at this exact point of his career to Smith. And the numbers are virtually identical, down to the number of hundreds and the number of 50s. And I think they're within like 100 runs of each other. And the average is within like half a run or something. So if looking for historical benchmarks, Ponting's always a good one in recent times. And Smith's right there with him, and who knows where this ends. He looked, as I said on the Daily Show,
went past him for catches as well.
He did. He's hit 200 and 200 even at
the lead Australian ever. So there's only 3 ahead of him now.
Yeah, I think it's 4. 4 with
he's level.
Root.
Callis had 200 on the dot,
right?
So he must. If he's got 200, he's equal, and then there'd be
Joe
Warden, Dravid, Root.
That's it.
Dravid.
Yeah. But it is like, where does this go from here for Smith? It's quite exciting because, you know, it would have been naive, and Barat and I spoke about this in the dailies. It would have been naive to have just ignored the Smith decline. It would have been disingenuous to have gone, he was great before.
And it was a 5-year decline.
Yeah, well, you know, but if you even want to do it on, if you want to root maths it and go from when he made the 100 at Lords onwards, as you kind of do when you're working in numbers and stats, you measure it from when the decline began, right? That's fine.
I measure it from the end of 2019. You know, that's when he really started to dip noticeably.
Sure, but no matter how you cut it, is my point. There was an obvious decline from his ridiculous peak, like he's averaging in the mid-70s for 5 years in a row, almost without precedent peak. Obviously, Bradman ruins all of the things you talk about with precedent. He looked young. He looked young.
Yeah.
Like, even interviewing him, he felt like I was talking to the Steve Smith of 6 or 7 years ago. I spoke to him before the second test. I'm like, yeah, in a good way. Because remember the way the captaincy really weighed him down towards the end? Retrospectively, you can say that, and it's easy to say that, but we did write and say this at the time. I remember doing an interview or something like that before the Durban test in 2018, acknowledging just how exhausted Smith felt and looked in his presentation. And of course, before the sandpaper test match, he did his angriest press conference ever when he was talking about Gigusa Rabada and the shirt front and all the rest of it. Like, there were signs that when he was captain that it didn't affect his run scoring ability, but it affected him as a person. Whereas now, I don't detect any of that. Maybe it's because he pinch hits, and when he gets to do it, it's a real thrill. And this is the best of Smith as a leader. So I don't anticipate he'll do it too many more times, because Pat Cummins is fairly resilient, and he's not going to take over from Pat. That's pretty clear. No. But it was a nice part of it.
And there should be a succession element as well. Yeah. Next time, I thought even this time potentially, but probably subcontinent, they go with Smith because he knows about field placements and so on. But whenever the next time is that someone else needs to step up, I think it should be someone else. They've done their dash with this. But yeah, it's interesting. And another behind the curtain bit, with this long decline, and with so even that South Africa tour, he didn't make any runs even before the sandpaper thing happened, really, by his standards. But so I was chatting with Mike, my editor at the Guardian, in December, and he was like, "What do you think? How terminal is the Smith decline thing? Is there a way out of it?" And I was kind of umming and ahhing over it, and we were like, "Do we write the piece? Do we sort of do the numbers on it and go, well, this is how long it's been going on for? Like, are we close to the end?" And I just remember saying, I've just got a bit of a vibe about Brisbane. I think I want to give it one more test and see what happens. I'm very, very relieved that I did, because it wouldn't have gone well if I'd written that piece just before this run started.
Yeah, the timing is everything when writing the someone stuffed piece, isn't it? Yeah, you take your soundings from people who watch him closely, and Barat was convinced that he would find a way to turn it around. The two caught down the leg sides weren't flattering, and Nor was getting his pad blown off first ball by Bumrah. But Bumrah was an occupational hazard for all of them through that series. And Smith, of course, back-to-back hundreds there, and now back-to-back hundreds in Galle, lays the foundation for who knows what. And that's really exciting, because it means that we can get back on that. It's fun tracking someone who's scaling remarkable heights, right? It's a fun thing to be part of the coverage of that. And, I suppose the next major marker for him is, can he reach 40 test tons? He'll get a chance to bat again in London, the city he probably loves more than any other. He's got 4 test hundreds in London, World Test Championship final. Where he bats in that final, who's to know? There'll be good problems to have for Australia when Cameron Green comes back into the frame. Sam Constas will open, and that means Travis Head will bat 5. Does that mean Labuschagne gets squeezed? Smith was vociferous in his support of Labuschagne after the test match the other day. So there's a lot to play out between now and June the 11th, Jeff. Good luck predicting that.
Yeah, I've pondered that. I mean, people are very negative about Labuschagne at the moment, which, I was after Perth and how bad he looked there. But they forget that he made, he's the match winner, really, in Melbourne. He made 70 in both innings, didn't he?
He did.
Thereabouts. And,
no, he did.
And particularly that second innings against Bumrah, when Bumrah was ripping up Australia again, and Labuschagne's the one who puts out that fire, and he made important runs in Adelaide as well. So, relatively low scorer. So he did.
It's like an overall numerical one, right? Like the World Test Championship cycle, because we're at the end of it right now. 36 innings, an average of 28, right? So in the cycle, Labuschagne's numbers look poor, because they are, based on the prolific numbers of, say, the previous World Test Championship cycle. Yes. However, if you go through
recent match-winning innings should offset that.
Well, you pick through it. Australia don't retain the Ashes in the absence of his 100 at Old Trafford. That's one. And Australia were asleep at the time, and it rained the next day, so no one remembers that. They were on the cusp of being resold there and losing inside 4 days. The 50 he made in Adelaide, which was a lot of it against the jagging pink ball, both on night 1 and afternoon 2. The twin 50s at Melbourne, you've touched on already. The second dig when Bumrah had them at 6 for 91, and he was about to turn the test on its head. It was Labuschagne who got in the way. So, I just feel like a little red inker at the end. I'm not being effusive here. Who knows what they'll do? Because Cameron Green, procedural fairness, has got a spot in that side, which was his at number 4. He was the match winner at Wellington this time last year, and his injury was at a dreadful time before the Border Gavaskar. So there was some consternation online yesterday when someone put on, I think it was Barat, said that Smith might bat 3, or might have been Tom. Either way, it was an SEN thing, saying that Smith might go to 3 to get Green in at 4, right? My immediate response to that is, if they leave Labuschagne out, Smith probably does go to 3. And he's made test hundreds at 3, many of them.
A lot of them. He liked 3.
Yeah, he did like 3. So it wouldn't be a monumental change to the frame. It'd be also a little bit of future proofing as well, because they want Green to bat 4 long term. But this is all to play out. And where, given that Head's very, very clear that he's going back to number 5. And again, there'll be massive structural changes from Galle to Lords, because of course they're not going to pick 8 batters and they're not going to pick 2.5 spinners. None of that's going to happen at Lords. So that'll be interesting to track. And I guess a few of them will get a chance to play some county cricket and bat in those conditions. We'll talk a bit more about that later on.
Yeah, 8 batters. I'm going to restrain myself from getting into that, but bloody hell, that was, I have a lot of time for Cooper Connolly as a batter, and I'm excited about what the future brings. But that was a cheap baggy Green. I really feel like that's so disrespectful to so many other players in Australia who do the work at state level to just chuck him in. Didn't even bowl.
It wasn't just chuck him in.
Clearly, Smith didn't rate him.
It wasn't
because he wouldn't let him bowl.
But it wasn't a just chuck him in thing. It was, the lived experience of watching it. Why would you have bowled him with Lyon and Kuhneman bowling as well as they were? That you didn't need to bowl him. They bowled 30 overs apiece on day 1 and were fucking awesome.
Yeah,
so
they both bowled more overs than.
No, yeah, sure. But I'm saying that you didn't need that as the part-time collective, Head, Webster, Connolly. They didn't need to. There was no need for the sort of dedicated 20 overs from an end third spinner thing. That never happened in this Test match, because they bowled them out cheaply enough that they didn't really need to exhaust their resources. And he was in the squad. I mean, it would have been lovely had Glenn Maxwell played last week at number 8, right? But he wasn't in the country at the time. So when they were extending their batting lineup, they had one choice. There was no other person on tour who could bat 8. And they not unreasonably went into that second Test match anticipating that it was going to be a snake pit. Because when I went out there, I was talking to you on the pod. Well, I was out there 3 days before the test, and they could have played on it then. So, and it was not a blade of grass on it. They thought that it was going to totally explode on them. That's what they said privately to us as well. It didn't ever quite get that far, although the energy Sri Lanka had with the ball was part of that story. They never gave themselves a chance to, with the lack of consistency with the way their spinners bowled. I got the theory behind extending the batting lineup. In the end, plays a shit shot. He'll pay for that. You pay for it when you make a mistake for Australia. He might get a chance in the Windies, but he might not. He might not. That'll be an interesting one to watch as well.
I just don't think he can play unless he's batting top 6. He's got no bowling pedigree. He's never taken a first-class wicket, and picking him in a bowler's spot, that's the bit that I think is insulting to players who are all-rounders or who are number 8s who could hold up their own with the ball and, to bowl 3 overs in the first 90.
Well, they had the flex, didn't they? They showed that they did that at Old Trafford with Green. So, they've shown a willingness to do it. I mean, Cummins told us before the 2022 second test that Maxey was going to bat 8 had they picked him. So they've got form on this type of thing when they want to extend the batting. It's just an unusual thing to happen.
But Maxwell's a more genuine bowling option than Connolly.
But he may not have been. He didn't bowl that often when in Bangladesh in 2017.
By 2022, Maxwell's had a 10-year plus career bowling for Australia across.
No, right. I'm just making the point that in 17, Maxwell barely bowled at India and Bangladesh when he. So
but
third spinners,
6, wasn't he?
But third spinners, I'm trying to say, third spinners often have a habit of not getting used as much. It tends to, like Murphy 2 weeks ago, right? Murphy barely bowled in the first test because they didn't really need him because the other two were dominating.
Sure.
So it's just one of those things where like all things in selection, I think to focus on that would be to deny the fact that they've, once again, the Australian selectors have had a fucking great tear, the way in which they nailed it with the 3 consecutive debutants who all made a contribution, the way they made the right change at the right time during the Border Gavaskar, parting ways with McSweeney and having someone disrupts the way that Consus disrupt and moving Mitch Marsh on at the right time. Like they, again, have demonstrated that selection is more than just runs divided by wickets equals selection. It's a tactile thing. It's a nuanced thing. And long may it remain that way. I don't want AI to take over. I don't want it to be spreadsheets. I like the fact that they've got to make these really tough, on-balance decisions. And that's part of the charm of Test cricket. So, yeah.
And then Sri Lanka, where does it leave them? Like you talked about the lack of energy, low energy Jeb Bush with the spin department. I mean, Prabhat Jayasuriya does come back and take a 5 for a bit of bloody expensive one, takes a Titch Freeman 5 for towards the end. When you're getting out, what did he got Carey out, didn't he, for 150? So they're never
opened it up. Yeah,
they're never great bags, but once the stable door has been open for about 3 weeks,
it's like he needed 2 wickets to get into it proper. He threatened on the I don't know what day it was. It would have been the second afternoon when he got Khawaja, I think it was. He threatened, right? It was Labuschagne, sorry, not Khawaja. But then he kind of went quiet for this was the majesty of the Smith-Carey partnership, that they just made Jayasuriya look like a club bowler. And he's not. He's not a club bowler.
He was.
He made the, yeah, he was. They made him look like a net bowler for like 3 hours there, and it was phenomenal batting. The Smith 100 was just one of his best, right? And Carey, with the enterprising way that he plays spin, reversing, lapping, sweeping, all the rest of it, never let Jayasuriya become the match winner that he occasionally can be. So when he came back the next day with the second Newey, went through Carey, takes the 5, it did keep them within touching distance. But yeah, I mean, I found it interesting and instructive that Dhananjaya says now that he wants flatter tracks. So he was intimating that like his spinners can't exploit raggers anymore. Like they don't have Murali, Herath. Maybe Jayasuriya isn't good enough to exploit those conditions in quite the same way. So, I mean, they kind of shit the bed by the end of the World Test Championship cycle. They finish in 6th spot and, you know, they're on a downward slide at the wrong time based on what you and I were talking about last week with who knows where the World Test Championship gets to in the next couple of months and how that intersects with the FTP and how long it'll be before we see a Warren Murali trophy played for again. I'm genuinely fearful they'll never play Test cricket against each other again if we have tiers as opposed to a league. And look, I know there's some news reports saying it will be promotion relegation, but like really? Are Australia, India and England going to expose themselves to the risk of relegation?
Sign up for the possibility of ending up second tier and, you know, yeah, I mean, if you're, particularly England, given how dicey they've been with their positioning, you know, are they going to honestly accept a risk that they're going to be playing Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and, you know, not playing the big teams?
Well, their TV bilateral agreements won't allow it, right? So yeah, they could sneak in, and this is the beauty of.
It'd have to be the relegation model with the outside series being allowed to be played.
Yeah, that's
the
right.
Way I could see it happening.
Yeah, like in baseball, right? When the National League team plays the American League and vice versa. I've probably explained that poorly, but you know, there is the provision to play teams outside of your comp in this. There's nothing preventing Australia from playing Zimbabwe at the moment. You know what I mean? Not even in the WTC. Of course they don't, but they could. And so it would be here. But yeah, to imagine that England would be able to arrange 5 Test match series against India and Australia if they weren't in the same division, that would be tough to square from a logistical perspective. But yeah, we saw this attitude during the week, Jeff. You would have seen the Jeff Allardyce story that was in The Age with Dan Brettig again, where he was told at the end of a day in Dubai that he'd have to apply for his own job. And then he realised that was writing on the wall stuff. And this is immediately...
It rarely tells you that you're going to be successful, does it?
And the involvement of the chairman of CA and the ECB in that process, and Jay Shah obviously running the show at the ICC. So will that be the precursor to undermining what we have? Probably. It has a bit of a vibe about it, doesn't it? That what we were speculating about on last week's show is only added to by this Allardyce decision.
Yeah. And yet, Test cricket, at least in an Australian context, never been more popular because, I mean, Channel 7 made a good call. They went, okay, interest is really high at the moment. Everyone's buzzing off the Australia-India series. Then they had the Women's Ashes to slot straight in next. They did great numbers for that on TV and at the ground, you know, like we talked about, even though it looks empty at the MCG. You know, we had some great correspondence in during the week from people who were there who were talking about how much better the atmosphere was sitting in the crowd than it seemed when you were watching on screen. And, you know, 35,000 people across 3 days at a women's test match is nothing to be sneezed at. But the TV numbers for that were good. And then tacking the Sri Lanka series on the end, it was a smart move. It's not yet footy season. The Australian Open was wrapping up. And so there was a sporting vacuum, and suddenly you've got Steve Smith back at a peak making a couple of hundreds, Alex Carey, a very popular player with a big innings, you know, Kuhnemann and Lyon doing the things that they're doing, and people tuned in.
Yeah, I want to say before I comment here, I've got no inside knowledge on this at all, so don't think that I'm speaking from a position of authority. I'm just speculating. Like, this might be a model for the future. Free-to-air television covering Australian away tours. Remembering that when they've been behind the paywall on Foxtel, it was put to me that like maybe up to 10 times the number of people were watching than would have been had this been on cable televisions. That's great. You know, more people watching Test cricket. I don't care how they find it. If people are watching and engaging, I'm all for it. 7 jumped in and took the opportunity. It was the biggest show broadcast on TV on day 2, I think, in Australia. I'm probably misrepresenting it, but something like that. And that was on the digital channel. That was on 7's 7 Plus, where you have to opt in to watch it, right? So that's a nice sign of what like might be possible. I know Amazon have the World Test Championship final, but then, you know, they play test matches in the Caribbean later this year, and there'll be other tours over the years that historically would just go straight to pay television. Well, you know, maybe this might be into the future something that brings more people into watching Test cricket. And if Seven can be that bridge, what a wonderful thing that would be.
Yeah, I don't see it happening for a Caribbean tour where it's going to be midnight till 8 a.m. kind of hours in Australia. And it's hard to see it happening anytime during footy season, where there's just so much competition there. But it'd be nice if it did.
Maybe, but I suppose it's all about like the opportunity cost, right? Well, it's about that's the wrong phrase, but it's about like what's the outlay required to do it versus what you're getting back in goodwill in promoting Test cricket when in the summer, that's Seven's biggest driver of traffic is the Test cricket. So having that ongoing commitment to it, we have this conversation at SEN, right, about by doing every Test match that Australia's men play, it develops a brand recognition that like SEN equals you're listening to Australia play when they're playing somewhere, right? So it might play out I'm not sure. Again, I've got no inside word on this at all, but it might be that Seven take that approach given how popular this series was. And they got that Border Gavaskar press release out this week, CA, which they absolutely obliterated all their viewing records across the platforms, and that's to be expected.
So 48% year-on-year increase, they said, in the viewing audience because it was a more low-key summer a year ago until Shamar Joseph did his thing. So average 1.5 million was the audience. They had, a whole bunch of sessions with over 1 million viewers. This is in a country with a population of 26, 27 million now. So they're pretty big numbers. Sydney averaged 2 million viewers, which is the best test in this broadcast deal. So they'll be hoping that the Ashes go past that as well. But you've got the India audience outside of the country as well, which was absolutely immense, the number that they cited. I enjoy this on YouTube as well when it gives you like number of hours watched. Which is such an arbitrary hard thing to get your head around, where it's like whatever, we've had whatever, how many million, like we're somewhere in the millions of hours watched of us standing there outside a ground shivering in the cold at 7 p.m. talking gibber about what happened that day. 52 billion hours of viewing time apparently. Figure that out. How many hours does that mean each individual person watched? I'm not sure. But what is it? That's 50 hours per head of population in India, basically.
Love it. Again, I have no idea how they clock out these numbers, and other stuff too about very healthy women's Big Bash League season. The BBL was probably the cherry on top, 20% up, biggest season since they went to the two broadcaster model with the men's Big Bash, which I know they've been trying to unlock that for a while, and it felt that too. Like the vibes of the Big Bash this year were different to other years. Yeah. I know we don't cover it too much on the final word, but I felt it. Like normally I wouldn't like take in as much Big Bash as we did this year.